Hello, ladies and gents, it's Justin Johnson. On the module DD211, yes, I will do. On the module DD211, understanding politics, ideas, and institutions in the modern world. The book is edited by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. On chapter 20, changing the state, terrorism in global politics, page 240. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, become the model that such groups sought to replicate and engender support for. Report 2004. It highlights how the third wave shares some commonalities with the first wave, with a return to focus on theoretical targets through assassination of key figures. The IRA's attempted assassination of Margaret Thatcher, with less focus on military targets, nationalism and radicalism, were also often combined, as seen in the activities of terror groups belonging to national minorities such as the Basques, the Corsicans, Irish and Kurds. Plane hijackings and kidnappings also become prevalent as a terror tactic by such groups. International terrorism moniker was received as groups sought to make linkages with one another, such as those between the IRA and the PLO, and between European leftists, groups and various Palestinian factions. During this wave, states also belong to sponsor certain groups to carry out attacks against hostile states, such as Libya's involvement in the Pan Am plane crash over 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Scotland in 1988. Subsequently, freedom fighter was no longer a popular refrain in UN debates, and the organisation acted to unanimously condemn acts of terror such as the 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏 bombing. The fourth wave, religious terrorism. The fourth wave has been termed by Rappaport 2004 as the religious wave, while religion has often played a significant role in modern terrorism. Until this wave, it had generally been tied to national liberation movements aiming to create secular states. However, following the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan of the same year, we can see that the start of what many would now recognise as modern Islamic terrorism. The 1980s saw alleged Iranian complicity in sponsoring terrorist acts in the Middle East, and the pouring into Afghanistan of thousands of volunteers from across Sunni Muslim world to fight the Soviets. The instability of Afghanistan following the Soviets' humiliating withdrawal in 1989 led to it becoming one of the prime destinations for terrorist training camps and a base for what would become Al-Qaeda, as we shall see later on in section 4. This confluence of events that led to the rise of Islamic terrorist groups was soon followed by the emergence of other religious-based groups such as the Tamil Tigers, who were campaigning for a separate Hindu homeland for the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. The Tamils regularly utilised the tactic of suicide bombing and, as Report 2004 points out, from 1983 to 2000, they used more suicide bombings than all Islamic groups combined. Other religious groups subsequently have used terrorist tactics to draw attention to their cause, such as Jewish groups, active in the 1990s, who waged assassination campaigns against Palestinian mayors and the Israel Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, and the Sikh groups campaigning for a separate homeland in the Punjab. A key feature of the Islamist terrorist movement with Al-Qaeda as its vanguard throughout the 1990s and 2000s was their focus on the US. In addition to the aim of removing US military presence from the Middle East, Al-Qaeda sought to expand the campaign to targeting US interests across the world. Thus, attacks were carried out on the US military base in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The first ever strike against a military vessel with Al-Qaeda's 2000 attack on USS Cole in Yemen, and the bombings in US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Attacks on the US homeland also took place in 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center and, of course, the events of 11th of September 2001. That's 9/11. One open question is whether this fourth wave has come to close. 𝗴𝗶𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀 2021 himself and others, example, 𝗬𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀 2007, has argued that a new wave based on ethnicity might now be started to emerge. With a focus on a certain one's existence and a priority of purity, various define the wave might offer a description that converts cases as varied as Boko Haram in northern Nigeria and radical right violence in the US and elsewhere. However, the persistence of the fourth wave makes it hard to argue that there has been the kind of decisive transition and that marked previous waves. Page 242. Terrorist networks in the global era. In addition to the waves of modern terrorism described above, we can also overlay the terms of transnational and global terrorism over the third and fourth waves. The emergence of transnational terrorism can be broadly equated with the new left wave described as above. It was during this period that terrorist groups increased their international reach and made connections with sympathetic groups across the world. The increasing availability of televised news coverage also had a major impact during the era, and terrorist groups sought to maintain public interest. With ever more spectacular attacks that were filmed by the international media, transnational terrorism continued in the 1980s and into the fourth religious wave, as the US became an increasing focus for terrorist acts, such as the suicide bombing of the US Marine barracks of Lebanon in 1983. With the end of the Cold War in 1989, the left-leaning groups of the third wave lost their main sponsor in the form of the Soviet Union, and the influence began to wane. However, they were soon to be replaced by militant Islamist groups such as Al-Qaeda, which, enabling by globalization, were becoming a global phenomenon. Terrorism and globalization. Thinking back to this block theme of globalization, you might want to think about how terrorism and globalization are interlinked, for example. What has the impact of globalization been on terrorism? Certainly, the events of 9/11 brought terrorism to widespread global attention. And while it is not a new phenomenon, as you have seen above, terrorism is certainly an area of global politics that is seemingly here to stay, and arguably an aspect of its study that remains in rude health. The waves of modern terrorism has been given us a brief chronology. Now we have to look at different explanations of how and why terrorism has become a global phenomenon, and the motivations behind it. 𝗀𝘁𝗏𝗃 2011, page 368 to 367, identifies three possible explanations for the vitality of global terrorism linked to globalization, culture, economics, and religion. We will take these in turn and also offer some criticism of such explanations. Cultural explanations. A cultural explanation of why militant Islam, for example, has been successful in certain parts of the world is linked to the idea of cultural globalization. In this view, the sense of Western cultural onslaught that promotes secular and material values is rejected by those who wish to preserve their cultural identity. Thus, there is a sense of such values chafing against others that are deemed incompatible. This therefore serves as motivation for protecting one's own culture and identity. This is expounded by Huntington, 1993, in the 𝗨𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀 𝗨𝗓𝗀𝗀𝗀 thesis, which states that the world is split into distinctive cultural or civilizational blocks, such as Western, Islamic, and Hindu. And that clashes will be inevitably occurred at the fault lines between civilizations because of their preserved incompatibility. This can be easily critiqued, owing to the fact that cultures or civilizations are not homogeneous, monolithic blocks that are some of the most intense conflict has come about as a result of sectarian division with such blocks. Think of the conflict between different sects with Islam and Christianity through history, for example. In the Muslim world, particularly in Iraq, Shia Muslims, who make up a minority of Muslims worldwide, but from a minority in Iraq, Iran and Bahrain, have long been targeted by extremist Sunni groups who view them as heretics. There are also a whole range of different, often conflicting standpoints in the Muslim world. Even with sectarian groups, the Muslim Council of Britain regularly speaks out against extremism, for instance. Think about how the views of Saudi, multi-Islamic scholar, might differ from those of the Egyptian one. The conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland is another case in the point against a neat but problematic division of the world into civilizational blocks. Also, intercultural exchange and cooperation has been a long history, be it through empire, trade, or diplomacy. It, in its many guises, to assume that certain cultures are threatened by an onslaught from another presumes that cultural influence is purely a one-way street. But the reality of globalization is that exchange and greater awareness is just as prominent a feature. Economic explantations. As an alternative explanation for terrorism can be found through emphasizing the economic factors that motivate such activity. With notions of cultural globalization, economic globalization has also seen the Western maintain its predominance in global economy. The pressure to confirm the neoliberal economic prescriptions such as privatization and deregulation can cause major social and economic upheaval. In turn, this can lead to disfranchisement and move towards activities that challenge the state, if there is a sense that the social contract with its citizens has been broken. Terrorist activity can therefore be seen as a consequence of perceived inequalities in the global economy, and as the symbols of capitalism are often synonymous with the US and its global reach, the US becomes a target. However, a view that emphasizes poverty and inequality as cause of terrorism ignores the fact that the backgrounds of terrorists vary widely. Burley's comment on the guilty white kids running to leftist European terrorist group, or the fact of Osama bin Laden come from a hugely wealthy background. It indicates that there is no definite correlation. The location of most terrorist acts is also indicative of the lack of correlation. For example, Sub-Saharan Africa has social economic conditions that might, on the face of it, favour the outbreak of terrorist violence. But as yet, it has not proved to be breeding ground for global terrorism. Religious explanations and new terrorism. Returning to 4 ways of modern terrorism, it is possible to discern a change for terrorism. That was by a large link to national causes of liberation. The movements to a new type of terrorism in the 4th wave. Within this wave, also we can see a change from religious-based terrorism that was largely regional and sometimes state-sponsored in scope during the 1980s to something much more global in recent times. As with the cultural explanation, religious explanations focus on the perceived negative effects of Western-led globalization and its more moral and spiritual bankruptcy. Islamic militants have utilized the concept of jihad, which traditionally refers to a struggle within oneself for spiritual purity, and applied it to their first fight against rulers of Muslim countries who they see apostates. They are not conforming to their interpretation of Islam, and to the non-believers, infidels, who are trying to push their own secularized agenda upon Muslims and threaten the spiritual purity of Islam as a whole. Critics of such an explanation might emphasize that while the Western observers seize upon religious reasons to explain why a terrorist might take their own life and those of others, this does not explain why the religious terrorist leaders, planners and coordinators do not matter themselves. Hi, you Al.
Right, what do you think about the picture?
Yeah, she's fine.